Thanks, Kat. I'm sure you'll recognise the volume of work undertaken by Kat and others within BAC to get us to this point. And as she was mentioning it, it's quite a significant move for BAC Council, a very progressive step. So the next question was, what do we do now? We've got all this information. What are we actually going to do with it? So we had a couple of options available. We can sit back and wait for our government to undertake their own review and then use our information and our policy position to challenge any decision we didn't like. Or we can own what sustainable shooting looks like, and we can operate proactively and actually lead the conversation. And I'm delighted to say that the steer at every level, from WLC to council to our exec team, was one of positivity in relation to being proactive, and that our sustainable shooting framework should be used to help make self-regulative recommendations. But we had a huge amount of information and we needed a method to communicate it. And this communication need was twofold. So how do we communicate with those who harvest wildfowl, so our members, the shooting community, and how do we influence the decision makers, so that's government and our DEFRA teams, our governmental ministers. So we started to create a code of practice to collate all of that information into a document that could be easily disseminated. And at the same time, we reached out to the teams responsible for the UK review. That was DEFRA and Nature Scott and within our devolved governments. And we decided to try and share our approach of what we believe sustainability should look like in the long term. Now, this led to lots of discussions, and I'll be honest, those discussions were actually really constructive, really reassuring. They were well mannered. Well, we pitched our sustainable shooting framework as we saw it to be a fit for purpose mechanism for making decisions. And so reassuringly, we'd actually analysed very similar data sets, and this gave us real credibility, and conversations, as I say, were constructive. The outcome of this was that BASC committed to the inclusion of 3 additional species that we had previously not identified as requiring action. Those were goldeneye, European white fronts, and common snipe. So we decided to embed those within our code. At the same time, the DEFRA team kind of committed to making sure that the minister, the decision-making body, was aware that the shooting sector was making significant progress in relation to self-regulation, and that might be a suitable option for the UK governments to conclude their review, i.e. to embrace our sustainable shooting code of practice. Now, that would have been a significant achievement. It had the potential for us to avoid a legislative outcome. And in the UK particularly, history states that once a species is removed from the quarry list, it never goes on. No, it never goes back on, which is why our policy position is one of self-regulation. But as often the case with the best laid plans, there's always an unexpected twist. We were due to hear from the minister at the end of May in 2024, but just days before we were due to receive a formal decision, a general election was called, and that stopped progress. I'll be honest, at the time that was quite demoralising for myself and the rest of the team. A lot of work had been undertaken to try and get us to a point of real proactivity, and that was squashed just by one announcement. But we quickly realised that nothing actually changed for us, so we had a commitment to deliver sustainable shooting. So we updated the code with additional recommendations and set about communicating it to the shooting community. So what about the code itself? The code itself is quite simple. It applies to ducks, geese, waders, and rails. It doesn't apply to release mallard because we have quite a large release population relating to driven shooting here in the UK. It doesn't relate to large bore historic firearms, and it doesn't override any site-specific requirements. So that's any legislative permissions, consents, or club rules or landowner wishes. This is just kind of an overarching layer of best practice. The broad sustainability principles are simple, and they kind of apply to everybody who harvests wildfowl. So whether you're a wild member of a wildfowling club shooting on the foreshore or an inland wildfowler over fed flight ponds, this equally applies to you wherever you harvest your wildfowl. And front and center of the recommendations, and this was a message that came out of our liaison committee really strongly, was the need for us to eat what you shoot, to take what you need, not what you can. We also stipulated daily maximum harvest recommendations, and these are broad, so 10 ducks per day, 6 grey geese. Now these are maximums, they're not targets. We also highlight that we want shooters to be investing in the evidence that will be informing future code updates through initiatives like WEBS, which is the Wetland Bird Survey. It's a long-standing data set that helps detail long-term trends in populations here in the UK. Bag data is a significant problem for us. It's an evidence gap. It's an evidence gap that we're trying to put in place processes to resolve, and hence the call within the code: collect data, share it. And citizen science is a really powerful initiative. As you heard from Lainey earlier about the Wing Survey, those sorts of initiatives provide real evidence that the shooting community is invested in making evidence-led decisions, that we're part of what the future looks like, and that our information is valuable. And we also need those to shoot to continue to invest time and money in the conservation work. And if we can make that work slightly more targeted through the evidence base and highlight things like pest and predator control that benefits many ground nesting species, and provide fit for purpose recommendation on how to do that, we can really enhance what we're currently offering, but also provide information that demonstrates the real value. Because for a very long time in the UK particularly, we've just gone about these good things quietly behind closed doors, which means when challenges arrive on our doorstep, we don't necessarily always have the information to put forward a counter argument. And so within the code, we also have species-specific recommendations. And these recommendations relate to the red species and the amber species that was highlighted on Kat's previous slide. So red, were pochard and pintail, require significant action. Amber needs consideration. That's woodcock, snipe, coot, moorhen, golden eye, scaup, and European white-fronted geese. So the one on your slide here relates to woodcock. And as you can see on each section, we contain a snapshot of the evidence which is available, which kind of gives the driver for action. Why do we need to do something at all? We then highlight the evidence gaps and the research required to plug those evidence gaps. And it details any changes required in shooting practice, and any habitat management interventions that might aid population recovery. And for woodcock, these principles have been really well recognised for a long time, and the shooting community is currently walking the talk, which is really great to see. As you can see from some of these stats from a survey that we undertook last year, and that survey concluded that over 90% of shooters were adhering to our best practice recommendations. This meant that we weren't harvesting woodcock until the migrants arrived in late November and early December. That's one of the key factors, because the issue with woodcock was our current UK breeding population, not the flyway population as a whole. So the fact that we're adhering to these principles is great news, but I think context is everything. And although what we're doing is really impressive, at a flyway level, the population is of least concern, and the migratory population coming to the UK totals circa 1.4 million birds every year. When we put that into context and we transfer it to a different species such as pintail, we're looking at an abundance figure of circa 20,000. I'll let those figures sink in. We've made significant inroads on changing attitudes for woodcock. So if we can do that for woodcock, surely we can replicate those sorts of recommendations for other species, perhaps species that, dare I say, are in far more need, like pochard or pintail. So for pochard, we're promoting a moratorium. That's no take. And for pintail, we recommend limiting harvest to 2 birds per person per day. Now, this isn't a figure that we just plucked out of the air. It's actually based on a review of bag data, the little that we did have available. And it identifies that on 87% of the times that pintail were harvested, we shoot either 1 or 2 birds. but the remaining 13% accounted for circa 30% of the annual harvest. So the recommendation not to shoot more than 2 birds would have quite a significant impact as a net reduction in harvest, but wouldn't impact the majority of shooters. And when we align that with the habitat recommendations, the increased research action that was required, we kind of feel that's a really fair trade. So the continued ability to take a harvest is a driver for all of those other positives, yet we can identify through science that it's a defendable position for us to be in. So how are we actually progressing? Now, personally, I think we're doing really well. In the first year, 50% of our affiliated clubs surveyed had adopted the code and its principles into their rulebooks and constitutions. And many others already had significant self-regulative measures in place that aligned with our code's principles. Now, we're currently reviewing progress ahead of year 2, and early signs are showing that we are making continued progress. I don't have the exact figures to share with you tonight, but if I was a betting man, I'd say we're going to be circa 70 to 75%, which is, a significant increase in adaptation. So going forward, the code's going to be reviewed every 3 to 5 years. Now, to do this, we need to invest in evidence, and that's part of things like the collaboration at Waterfowlers network level and the wing survey that we've already talked about. But at a UK level context, we've also gone out and co-funded a significant evidence review with Natural England. That evidence review looked at grey literature specific to wildfowl harvest and disturbance within the protected site network. You see, many of our estuaries and marshes are designated as protected sites, yet our wildfowling clubs were managing those very areas long before they were considered for designation. And in some cases, that management work undertaken by the clubs would have formed the basis of the reason for designation. Yet our research highlights the appropriate scale for management is at a flyway, yet our regulators, as Kat hinted at earlier, are often regulating at a sector level. That's it's ecologically inept, and the restrictions imposed are causing significant issues for our wildfowling clubs, and it's something BSE is continuing to try and work to resolve. Now, the Waterfowlers network provides us with the opportunity to operate at a scale where we can truly be meaningful and progress can be made. At the annual Waterfowlers meeting earlier this year, we had some really challenging conversations, I think others in the room would agree, that led to the drafting of a network-wide set of sustainable shooting principles, broadly following the sustainable shooting principles within the BASC code. Now, this commitment will undoubtedly lead to further collaboration and hopefully the formation eventually of flyway-wide shooting and conservation recommendations for key species like pochard, like pintail, like widgeon, and we can have conversations like this on an annual basis, and that will be a hugely positive move. So going forward, BSE is going to continue to manage what sustainable shooting looks like through self-regulation. That's our policy position. Outside of the UK, we've contributed financially through our wildlife fund to the restoration of wetland habitats in Finland. As Veli-Matti mentioned earlier, they are one of the duck factories. I know many other members of the Waterfowlers network have also made similar contributions. And if we can identify what the issues really are and then collectively try to resolve them, we'll make the biggest possible impacts. So if we want to see populations recover in the UK, which I certainly do, no matter what the interventions are, we're a wintering ground. We need to be working to turn the tap back on. That doesn't happen by regulating the UK. It doesn't happen by sustainable shooting regulation in the UK. It happens at flyway scale. We're going to do this. It's not just for our members of today. It's not just for each of the members of our respective organisations. That's not what we're doing this for. We're doing this to leave behind a legacy so that the next generation can venture out into some truly wild places to enjoy a sunrise over a remote coastal marsh or an inland flooded pool and continue to take a sustainable harvest to put birds on the table for many, many years to come. So can I say a quick thank you to Klaus, to Lainey, to Velimiati, and the other members of the Waterfowlers Network. I'm thoroughly enjoying working with you all, and I hope that our continued contributions will help protect our way of life, because it is a way of life. It's not a pastime for me. It's a way of life for the long term. So thank you for listening, and I hope you have a very enjoyable season ahead, and I'll hand back to Klaus for any questions.